Hey everyone, thank you for joining another episode of Banking on Experience. I'm your host, James Gilbert. Today I'm joined by Andy Rossmeissl. He's the founder and CEO at Faraday. Thank you for joining us, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, James.
So today we are going to talk a little bit about some fun topics. So do you want to let's let you give the introduction on what we want to talk about today. First of all, why are you so passionate about this topic?
Oh man, I mean, prediction is the future. It's we're hearing it in everything from the cars we drive to how we're learning these days. It is being quickly incorporated into every aspect of our lives. It's really reminds me of the rise of the internet.
Love it. Andy, let me ask you a quick question really quick so the audience can get to know you on a personal level. What do you celebrate most about where you are in your life right now?
Woo, that's a good question. Faraday is very oddly in the state of Vermont. There aren't a whole lot of tech companies in Vermont. Actually, there aren't a lot of companies in Vermont. But this has been quite the year, as we all know. And I feel very thankful to be here in a state like Vermont. Access to the beautiful outdoors, good people, supportive folks, all trying to make the best of a tough year. And so I feel very, very thankful to be out here right now.
Love it, Andy. Love it. Let's start the conversation off with, WTF is predictive analytics? I mean, seriously, like what in the world is predictive analytics? Let's start
that's
there.
A good question. I mean, it's a great buzzword, right? So there's that. Analytics is just this concept, broadly speaking, that there is some kind of value hidden in data. And if we just look at it hard enough in the right way, then we're going to get something out of it. And so, you've probably heard of descriptive analytics. More and more these days we hear about prescriptive analytics, analytics tools that tell you what to do. The only different thing about predictive analytics is that we are, looking for patterns that you can use to make, going forward, better decisions. People get really, I think, intimidated by, the word predictive model, right? Well, is there a robot that's making, wild decisions that, are just going to take us off guard? And it really isn't. What I tell our clients at Faraday is the way to really wrap your head around predictions is that a predictive model is really just a boring list of dumb patterns. And now it may be a very long list, and some of these dumb patterns may be very, very complex. Maybe people matching 100 different attributes are likely or unlikely to do something. But end of the day, we all understand this, right? We can imagine going through a checklist of patterns and being like, James doesn't meet any of these, or he meets a lot of them. And in doing so, we start to recognize James as being likely or unlikely to take some kind of action. So predictive analytics is just a way to use these very simple, decades-old algorithms and scientific approaches to come up with these patterns and then apply them to new data.
Yeah, here's the news flash for all of our listeners. Out of all the industries that are out there, banking has been using predictive analytics behind the scenes with consumers. If you think about it, credit scores. What do you think that is? It's a predictive way to show whether you should lend somebody some money or not. Guess what? You've actually been doing it. But I think there's levels to this. And I think that's what we're going to get into today, which is what I'm really excited about, because this is actually a little bit some of my background, right? And up my alley too, where I get geeked out by this kind of stuff. So let's start with the very first question. What should everyone stop doing today with their predictive strategy?
Oh man, that's an obvious one to me. You just got to stop trying to roll your own. It is too hard. I'm seeing brands all the time right now who, very rightfully, they know that prediction is the future. They're trying to get on board. They're trying to find the right way to get ahead with predictions. But, they all start with this sense that they've got to do it themselves. And that means they're trying to find data scientists, and the data scientists, if they can find them, makes them realize that there is a whole lot more to data science than just one person who calls themselves a data scientist. You need, data and integrations, and you need algorithms and compute and feature engineering and deployment and all these, pretty complex things. The way I try to, frame it for folks is, if you're doing e-commerce these days, the last thing in the world you want to do is write your own payment software. You're just not going to do that. You're not going to hire a payment specialist. You're just going to go use Stripe, right? And unfortunately, that kind of common sense, obvious approach that brands and developers and partners have been taking for a couple decades now about using APIs where you can, hasn't quite caught on yet with prediction. And so that's the biggest mistake I see out there for sure.
Ooh, this is a good one, because I think that, using the same example that I gave just a little bit ago about the credit bureau, like imagine if every bank and credit union were to try to replicate that. I mean, come on now, like there's a level here that we have to realize that is outside of our scope, right?
Yeah. And
I also like to, I give a lot of like references on the podcast. And one of the things that I like to reference with predictive analytics is sports. If you're a fan of sports, they do this as well. Field goal percentage in basketball, true shooting percentage in basketball. Now imagine if every single fan out there was trying to create their own true shooting percentage for basketball players. It would be a nightmare. So I also think that there's a level of expertise here that we have to rely on, right? So that brings me to my next question. We talked a little bit about what people should stop doing. So what should they start doing to get this going?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think brands often struggle with this because they feel like they either have to jump into the deep end and have a revolution internally, or they just don't. And, I think that I understand where they're coming from, but there are actually extremely incremental approaches to prediction. And the place that I generally recommend people start is with personalization, which is something that, it's very intuitive, right? We all know that as we're reaching out to folks, if we could only speak their language, we could probably get along with them a lot better. And unfortunately, everybody makes this cognitive leap then to, all right, well, that means I need to have one-on-one conversations with everybody. And that obviously that approach doesn't scale, especially now where so much interaction is taking place remotely. So then there's this natural thought, well, okay, maybe I need to do focus groups, and we need to do a bunch of qualitative assessment, and we need to come up with these kind of grandiose, customer profile reports and things like that. And that, very often is kind of the end of the story, because brands don't have the money or the time to do something like that. It turns out that machine learning, which is, one of the most powerful forms of AI and what we use at Faraday, can do all that for you in seconds. If you have it all set up the right way. There's an algorithm called k-means clustering, and another class of algorithms called anomaly detection. And by applying these algorithms to your customer data, if you have a bunch of consumer data about them, the algorithms can discover nice, coherent, meaningful, narratively obvious groups of your customers that become extremely useful for you to know. We all have, I think, an intuitive grasp that a customer who is fresh out of college, just moved to the big city, living, by themselves in their first apartment, is going to have very different banking needs than a retired couple who are recent empty nesters and they're looking to downsize. Unfortunately, I think so many financial institutions send the same email to both of those people, and they do their best, right, to try to adopt a posture that is inclusive, and many of them do a great job of that. But just imagine if you could just send out just two versions of your email. doesn't have to be 100 different versions. It could be 2 to 5 or so. That kind of personalization is actually very much within your grasp, and often the place I advise folks to start with predictions on.
I'm curious, mostly for my own sake, because I didn't have this as something that we were necessarily going to hit on, but I am curious now. Who in an organization typically do you see want to act on predictive?
Yeah. I would like to say that it's a specific title or role, because that would make my LinkedIn searches a lot easier. But it's more often, I would say, intangible qualities. We see this a lot in credit unions where there are folks just drawn to that industry who just happen to be, the right balance of like emotionally available and caring about their member group, but at the same time also kind of curious and innovative and looking for ways to push the envelope. And I think it's that combination of curiosity and sensitivity that really makes the best Faraday user. People who know that there's a better way to do their job if they just had the right data to help them.
Like it.
Yeah.
So like you touched on this a little bit about what the biggest challenges that you see people face today. But let's double down on it. What specifically do you think is the biggest challenge that people face with predictive? Is it organization of the data? Is it orchestration of the data? Is it adoption of the data? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wish it were one of those things, because if it's an upstream thing, like it's hard to get the data together, or it's hard to match it, or something like that, then you could solve it. I would say that the biggest challenge is often a cultural or political one. We can step in and Faraday. It's our job here. Our software makes it extraordinarily easy to connect your data, define your predictive objectives, and then deploy predictions out to your systems. But the hardest part often comes at the end of the story there, the epilogue. When Faraday finishes its work and it's the brand's turn to employ that data that was just deployed, and do it in a way that's automated, meaningful, and create value out of it. That's where there can often be differences of opinion. There can be like really deeply entrenched beliefs about the business or the brand that maybe aren't true. And it can be a challenge for folks, especially those curious champions we have within an organization, to put their neck out and say, I know that we've believed for 10 years that we do a great job of engaging millennials, but we don't. I would say that that's the real challenge. Luckily, I think that's going away. I think people are really starting to recognize that prediction is the future, and you really got to get on board, and you can't just kind of pay lip service to it. So there are, I guess, 3 main ways I would say that financial institutions have been most effective at, solving that political dilemma and really letting prediction start, guiding their business. And the first is in lending, where, as you say, we've had credit scores, which are predictive for a long time, but they're only really predictive of risk, right? You can't even legally use them until there's a clear firm offer of credit and interest in the consumer. But it's also just not, it turns out, at all correlated with interest. In fact, sometimes it's inversely correlated. People who are most interested in a certain product may be the ones who have the highest risk for it. Propensity prediction, which is something that we do here at Faraday. We make 4 kinds of predictions, and propensity is one of them. Can be really helpful because it is kind of a dicey, multivariate sort of problem that we're trying to solve there, and that prediction can be very valuable for that. The second thing is one that, growth teams have been wrestling with forever, which is, understanding the power of promotion, right? Sales, discounts, offers to drive engagement, but also recognizing that there's a meaningful hit to your unit economics. Wondering, I think everybody who's been in this position has wondered, well, there must be some way to do this right, and often instead we oscillate between, we're missing our numbers. Let's turn that tap on for promos, and great. But now the board's worried about our unit economics. So you turn the tap off, and you just kind of bounce back and forth between these two extremes. It turns out there is a right way to do it. And obviously it has to do with predictions, or I wouldn't be up here talking about it. But it really involves using machine learning to predict what a given customer's total lifetime value will be. And there's a great, algorithmic way to do that. And then you just compare that to the value that you've realized with that customer to date. And you're going to find in some cases that there's a huge gap. There's a bunch of unrealized value with a given customer. And often all they need is a little nudge to start recognizing that. And so those are the kinds of people that are really valuable to apply promos to. And on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have people who maybe they have a high LTV, but they've really tapped out. And yeah, if you promote them, maybe they would adopt another product, but you're never going to really get much more margin out of them. And people on the other end of the spectrum too. So another place where we are seeing financial institutions have had this perennial problem, and predictions finally this new opportunity for confronting it. And the last one, I think is maybe the most acute, which is, in this new era of all these new fintech concerns and all these banks, and especially over the last year going remote, and, people seeking to address their banking needs online, loyalty really becomes a question, and churn is something that is just wildly volatile. And it used to be that you could kind of pay attention to engagement metrics like, branch visits, email engagement, things like that. But now, loyalty is so volatile at this point that often if you've waited long enough to recognize that there is some kind of impact on engagement, it may be too late. So prediction really needs to step in, because you can, these algorithms can pick up on intrinsic churn risk, things about the person's, where they live or their personality that may indicate a churn risk, but also other more situational signals that may appear in the data, but wouldn't necessarily yet have manifested in their engagement with the brand. So those are the big three challenges right now I see for FIs and how prediction can help.
These are good. I wrote them down because I was like, I know I'm going to get this recording, and I'm on the podcast, so of course I'm going to get it. But man, I wanted to write them down because that's some good stuff, man. I like it.
Those are the secrets.
Let me ask you an interesting question. If someone were to give you $10,000 right now to do your job better, what would you do with it?
Are you offering? My wife would say I should take a vacation and clear my head a little bit, and I do a hell of a lot better after that. But I would say that this year has been tough for many companies, and certainly ours, in that I just haven't been able to see my colleagues a whole lot. We have a tradition at Faraday of doing annual offsite kind of retreat things in various beautiful locations in Vermont. And we haven't gotten to do one now in, a year and a half. And so I think I would take that $10,000 and I would set up a series of picnics over the summer, get good catering and, lure my busy team with some good food, maybe hire a band or two, just so I could get some face time with folks. I know that's where I get all my best ideas from, and it's hard to do these days. So that would certainly help.
I like it. You know, it's interesting is I started here at CRMNEXT a little over 12 months ago, is right after the pandemic happened, and I have yet to meet anybody in person on my team. It's been tough, but you know, like we've gotten through it. I think it's made people kind of respect each other a little bit in a different aspect too, which has
Yeah.
been both good and I think sometimes bad. So it's good. So let's move into the next couple of questions. What kind of data do you think? And I think you touched on this a little bit, kind of the three challenges. Some of this data is incorporated in there, but what kind of data do you think is the most important to use with predictive?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Those three challenges, they do require engagement data, product adoption data, things like that. But if I wanted to sort of take a different angle on this and look at the quality of the data, I think I'd honestly point to ethical data as being the data that we need to focus on more in this industry. There's been extremely valid concerns over the last several years about, whether or not it is good or right, or should be even legal to pull data off the web that people are saying on Facebook or on Twitter or other places and use it for wildly different purposes. At Faraday, we've had a policy since day one here that we do not scrape data. We never have, and we never will. We think it's honestly really creepy. And then there's been simultaneously in a totally different area of the web, but same concept is with tracking cookies. This is, we had GDPR and CCPA take care of data privacy, but tracking cookies are just as big of a dilemma. It is not obvious to human beings that everything they do online is surveilled. And even, I've been an internet person since before there was the web, and it still isn't in my reptile brain yet that is happening. So, again, we've had a policy here at Faraday. We've never done cookies, device IDs, and we never will. But boy, I tell you, it is tempting for a lot of companies operating in prediction to go that route. It's cheaper, but you really do get what you pay for. And then the last thing is you always have to keep in mind, with data that prediction is always just looking back at history and finding the patterns that occurred there, and then projecting them out into the future. And the algorithms are not smart enough to know if historical patterns were intrinsic or whether they were imposed by some kind of misguided regulation or systematic prejudice. And so, you have the data that you use, you have to look at it askance, and you have to always be kind of like skeptical of the data to make sure you're not just perpetuating racism or sexism or any other form of prejudice out there. So that's what I would say to summarize is, like, if you're going to do prediction, either use a partner like Faraday where it's just built into the software that ethics are as valuable as anything else, or please take the steps to do it right, because otherwise you're going to end up hurting a whole lot of people.
I'm actually really glad you brought up the cookie thing, because this is going to be a bigger problem for so many marketers out there that have their technology so reliant upon that cookie data. And I don't think enough people are preparing for it. Like I can't tell you, the last 6 months I've gone through every one of our vendors and I've done a deep dive with them on what is their plan for this new cookie policy. And I don't know that everyone's even thinking that way. Like, it's just going to happen. And guess what's going to happen with that? Your marketing is going to fail really bad, because there's so many people that rely on it. So I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because I do think it's an important thing for everyone to be looking at. If you're not familiar with the cookie laws that are coming out, like Google iOS 14 update and put cookie at the very beginning of it. It will blow your mind.
I'll give you the easiest rule of thumb in the world for how to tell if you're being ethical with your identification. And it is, if you know your own identifier of a certain kind of identification, I would call it fairly okay. Because if I were to guess here, James, if I asked you your iPhone device ID, would you know that?
No.
Off the top of your head? Right. And if I asked you your Facebook cookie ID, which is a ridiculous SHA-256 hash or something, neither of us would know that either. But we do know our addresses. We literally put them on the front of our houses. We know our phone numbers. We put them in phone books. We publish our email addresses. So, that's the easiest rule of thumb in the world, is just identify people the way they identify themselves, and you'll avoid a whole lot of trouble that way.
Love it. Good advice. Okay. One more question for you.
Yeah.
How can financial institutions measure the success of a predictive strategy?
You just trust us. It's fine. No, we take this really seriously at Faraday. We're a bunch of data nerds. That's why we started the company. I know you are too, James. You have to measure. We use two things in tandem that, sorry to get into the weeds a bit, but one of them is a control group, and that allows one to measure the efficacy of the predictive model being used, because you essentially take your high scores and you treat them, but you also take a few other randomly selected people and you treat them, and you see if, in fact, the people you scored highly do convert at a higher rate than everybody else. And the other group we use is a holdout. And I know it sounds like a nuanced distinction, but it's kind of huge. A holdout is a group of people who score highly, but you actually don't treat them. And the idea being, because they score highly, it's probably because they're super likely to do something anyway. And so it allows you to really challenge yourself as to whether or not this form of marketing or outreach or engagement is actually producing any kind of marginal value. So if you do that, and we have a whole system built into Faraday for control groups and holdouts, but you can do it yourself. It's not rocket science. You're able to discern a whole bunch of diagnostic information about your growth activities, and you can stop, just kind of licking your finger and putting it into the wind. Oh yeah, it feels, I love this new Facebook ad. It must be doing well. So just measure, lift. That's the key word.
Love it. Andy, last question for you. Where can people find you in Faraday?
We're at Faraday.ai, and my email is Andy@Faraday.ai.
Awesome. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. For all of our listeners out there, please go to the podcast, subscribe. Let us know what you thought of this episode as well. Love to hear from you. Thanks again, Andy.
Thanks for having me, James.